All right, so this is nervous system and nervous tissues. Uh, what we are going to be studying will be very close to what we study when we look at muscle system and muscle tissue as well. And so your understanding of that chapter helps you with this as well. So the nervous system and the endocrine system are the primary systems that control your homeostasis. And if you remember the other time when we looked at chapter 1, I told you how that regulatory activity in your system, because we are osmoregulator, we are thermoregulators, we regulate our environment. So we spend a lot on metabolism. We spend a lot of energy on metabolism to generate temperature, to generate an internal environment that is conducive for survival, and not we are not based, we are not regulate, we are not we don't conform to our environment. We regulate our temperature by ourselves. And so the nervous system, the brain, controls whatever happens coupled with the activity of the endocrine system. Nervous system responds to different stimuli based on impulses, and I will be talking about that. Now, when you hear impulse, so the way I differentiate it, even though we use impulse and stimuli interchangeably sometimes, and it's okay, but sometimes I like to differentiate it. Now, stimulus is I am going on the street and a needle, and I step on the needle. I have just received a stimulus. Now, that stimulus is going to, the message from that stimulus travels to the brain processes the stimulus and generates an impulse. The impulse is what we call action potential. Now, that impulse is simple. It's simply like what you say when you say, I just have an impulse to do this thing. It means you just have an intuition. You just feel like doing this thing. An impulse is a potential action, and that's why it's called action potential. Action potential is not an action. It's a code to initiate an action. All right. So when you say so what happened is, so I tell people I have an 11-month-old now. Sorry, she's going to be 11th on the 5th. 11-month-old baby, right? Or 10 months. Now, when she sees fire, what's she going to do? She's not going to run if she sees fire. She may likely be curious, depending on the kind of personality she has, to go and touch it to see what it is. All right. Merita says she's going to stay there. She stays there. If she's the curious type, she goes ahead to touch it to see what it is. Now, but she's not likely going to run. The reason she's not running is because it's not because she doesn't have upper limbs and lower limbs. It's because a nervous coordination does not interpret that as danger. That's why she sees hot plate or stove and she wants to touch it, because our nervous system does not interpret it as danger. All right. So what determines the activity of your muscles, the activities of your limbs, the activities of your upper limb, lower limb? It's a function of what the nervous system tells them. Now, that you saw fire, that you step on needle, does not mean your nervous system, your skeletal muscles will randomly contract. It's going to be a function of what the nervous system tells it to do. So the interpretation of the stimulus based on the nervous system is going to generate an impulse for that, which is what we call action potential. So what we call action potential is simply a plan of action, which is the same as impulse that is generated for the nervous system based on what you are exposed to in your environment, which is what we call stimulus. All right. So the word action potential is nothing big. It's simply like an impulse, just like, oh, I have an action plan. I have something that I want to do, action potential. So the nervous system allows for perception, movement, behavior, and memories. Let's go. Now, what are the components of your nervous system? Now, the nervous system is predominantly, the major part of the nervous system is actually the cell that we call neuron. So the neuron is actually the major cell of the nervous system. Now, the second class of cells that we have there are the neuroglial cells. Now, the neuroglial cells are supporting cells. They support the activities of a neuron. They are not an actual cell, or they are not actual cells. Their action is simply to support the action of a neuron. All right. So the idea is that for every neuron, there will be portion, maybe like about 5 or 10 neuroglial cells that are supporting. Now, neuroglial cells is also the same as glial cells. So in some textbook, you will see glial cells. It's still the same thing. You see neuroglial cells, they are the same thing. I'll be talking about the structure of neurons and also the kind of neuroglial cells that we have, either in the brain, the spinal cord, the central nervous system, or in the peripheral nervous system. All right. So part of the nervous system is the brain, the spinal cord. Now, the brain and the spinal cord create the central nervous system, which we call the brain and spinal cord create central nervous system, which we call the CNS. So when you hear CNS, it's simply the brain and the central nervous system. Now, every other path creates what we call peripheral nervous system, PNS. PNS, peripheral nervous system. All right. I believe you are making your note, PNS, peripheral nervous system. Now, the major functions that the nervous system does, from the analogy I placed earlier, is there are 3 major functions, right? It's sensory function. Now, think about the sensory function as senses, to sense something, to receive stimulus. All right. So the nervous system detects internal and external stimulus or stimuli. All right. Now, I will explain some few things here, which I want you to take very good notes. I've pointed to it sometimes ago, but I'll point to it again. Now, sensory duty is simply when stimulus is received and it's brought into the central nervous system. You see that? Into. So I call it sensory input. Let me see if I could type here. I call it sensory input. Now, sensory input is the same as afferent duty. So now, anywhere you see sensory, now sensory input is just my word. I'm just saying sensory neuron bring message into, it brings input. And these neurons, or anytime you are talking about bringing message into the central nervous system, into a place, we talk about afferent neurons. All right. Now, the other part is the motor, which does output duty. So you want to take note of this in your notes. And that is done by efferent neurons. All right. So this is the way it works. If my muscles now are going to contract, my muscles do not just contract by themselves. They just don't randomly say, with what I'm seeing now, I should contract. No, muscles don't have any decision. Skeletal muscles don't have any decision by themselves. Smooth muscles don't have any decision by themselves. They act based on the message the neuron is bringing them through the central nervous system. So how does the message get to the central nervous system? Sensory neurons does that. Sensory or afferent neurons bring message, bring stimulus into the central nervous system, like you can see there. Now, the message that is brought into the central nervous system by either sensory or afferent neurons, those messages will be processed. It will be internalized. It will be considered, and a decision will be made. Now, when that decision is made, That decision is what we call integrative function. You see, perception, conscious awareness of the stimuli involve interneurons. Now, the neurons that does this job, we call them the interneurons. The interneurons does this integration job. They process the message that has come into the sensory input or the sensory neurons or afferent neurons. Now, after a decision has been made, now the hypothalamus, the CNS now say, okay, with these stimulus that we received, Professor Hay needs to run out of this office ASAP. Now, that message now will travel through the motor neurons or through the efferent neurons. Then it travels from the CNS. Then it's going to go to the effectors. What are the effectors? It could be muscles or it could be glands. Now, if it is muscle, then I'm going to start running out of this office. Maybe I saw something. Or maybe fire alarm just starts ringing. The message comes to the brain processes the message and say, Professor, hey, you need to run now. Fire alarm is ringing. Now, but if somebody already have brain damage, that message comes, but there will be no neuron to process it. There will be nothing to process it. So the fact that the person is hearing fire alarm does not mean the person should run. And so a stroke patient may not understand those things, not because those things are not happening, not because the person does not have eyes, not because the person does not have ears, but because the person's sensory central nervous system is damaged. The brain is damaged. So there's nothing to process the message to tell the person, do this. Nothing. All right. So that's the difference. And that's how important the central nervous system or the nervous system is. So once the decision is made, the motor neuron or the efferent neuron takes the message now and take it to either the muscles to contract or to the glands to secrete hormones, either for pancreas to secrete insulin or glycogen, or glucagon. All right. So it goes that way, and that is the way the central nervous system function and coordinates activities of the body. Again, this is the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is neuron that are outside of the central nervous system. All right. So you have the cranial nerves, you have the spinal nerves. Cranial nerves means nerves that are associated to the brain. Spinal nerves, the one associated to the spinal cord. Ganglia, they are accumulation of cell bodies, which I'll be talking about. Then you have sensory receptors that pick stimuli that will be sent to the central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system also include, can be divided into somatic nervous system. When you hear somatic, soma means body. Soma means body. Soma means body. So when you hear somatic, anything somatic cell means body cell, somatic nervous system means the portion of the nervous system that affect the body. So now this is what are cause voluntary actions. If it causes voluntary actions, it means it's the guide that affects skeletal muscles. I'm going to use test. That will be better. So this affects its innervate or control skeletal muscles. All right. So this controls your skeletal muscle, skeletal system, and so that generates voluntary actions. Autonomic nervous system controls. We say that it's automatic, right? We say I just use the word that is automatic. Now, automatic for me, it's not a biology word. It's just saying it's automatic. It happens automatically. You don't control it by yourself. So we say it's involuntary. All right. These are involuntary activities. And so the muscles that are involuntary in our system, you see they are the smooth muscles. The smooth muscles are involuntarily controlled. Cardiac muscles are involuntarily controlled. So those muscles are controlled involuntarily. Then the enteric nervous system is the portion that controls your GI tract, gastrointestinal tract. All right, that is the enteric nervous system. We'll talk about it more. Let's go. Now, so the peripheral nervous system, like I told you, it's somatic nervous system, and somatic nervous system is also going to have, it include the sensory input. Now sensory neuron, it tells you that these are also afferent neurons. They are sensory neurons. They bring information that is on the head, body walls, limbs, spatial senses. They bring it into the central nervous system. Then, like I told you, sensory does input. You remember? Sensory does input. So they are bringing information, gathering information from every part of the body, majorly like this, all the limbs, bring it into the central nervous system. And then the motor will bring out the decision of the central nervous system and take it to the skeletal muscles for voluntary movements so that there will be contraction and the muscle can move. Autonomic nervous system, it will pick all the information from the visceral. Now you remember visceral organs are organs inside cavity. So the brain, the spinal, the heart, the lungs, the kidney, bring information from all of that to the central nervous system. That is the sensory. Then the motor will take the decision from the brain and take it to the smooth muscles, cardiac muscle, and gland to control. Like I told you again, involuntarily controlled. And then the motor part of this is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic system. All right, so that's the way the system works. Major thing I need you to understand is that sensory, don't forget that, is the same thing everywhere. Anywhere you hear sensory neurons, they are bringing stimulus into the central nervous system. And when you hear motor neurons, they are bringing stimulus, they are bringing the impulse, the decision of the nervous system, take it to the effectors, which will be muscles, gland, as the case may be. Now, interneurons are the portions, are the neurons that process that helps with the interpretation of the stimulus. An enteric nervous system, like I told you, they don't function with the autonomic nervous system and central nervous system. The major thing that they do is that they monitor changes within the gastrointestinal tract or stretching of the wall. So they control contraction of smooth muscles in the GI tract. They control the GI tract secretion, gastric juice, pancreatic juice, all of those secretions, bile in the GI tract, gastrointestinal tract. They regulate hormone producing endocrine cell of the tract. All right. Now we are going to look at the nervous cells now. The nervous tissue, it's made up predominantly of two cells. The major cell of the nervous tissue is the neuron. And then we have the neuroglial cells. Now, the neuron is the major cell, like I told you, and it's the one that does all of the functions that we have been saying, demonstrating electrical excitability, meaning that they get excited by stimulus. When stimulus comes to their membrane, they don't stay gentle, they act, all right? They are able to respond to stimulus, so they detect changes in the environment. If there's cold, you know it's cold. If it's hot, you know it's hot. If something is smelling, you know that something is changing here. And how the long run, they generate what we call action potential. Now, action potential in muscle that we discuss in muscle is not different from the action potential we are discussing here. The only thing is what we are looking at here, we are looking at how the nervous system generates the action potential. When we look at muscles, we look at how the muscle transfer the action potential to, how the neuron transfer the action potential to the muscles. But now we want to look at how is the action potential generated by the neurons or by the nervous system. Now, the neuroglial cells, like I said, we call them supporting cells, and their job is to support the neurons. They don't have a job by themselves. Everything they do is to support the mission or the vision of the neuron. So they nourish the neuron, they protect the neuron, and they help to maintain homeostasis in the environment of the neuron to keep the neuron in a healthy state. Now, the parts of a neuron. I'll go ahead and look at the image rather than looking at the stories here. So looking at this is a neuron, and you have some part of the neurons that are very, very important to look at. Now, when you look at this, I'll start with this smaller image here. I will discuss the part of the neuron here, then I'll come to the larger image there. Now, first thing here is there are three parts of a neuron. Number one is the dendrite. Now, don't confuse it. I've talked about different neurons that does different job. I've talked about sensory neurons. I've talked about interneurons. I've talked about motor neurons. Sensory neurons are the same thing as afferent neurons. Motor neurons are the same as efferent neuron. Now, generally now we want to look at the parts of a neuron. We are not looking at part of sensory neuron. We're not looking at part of motor neuron separately, because we are looking at the general structure of all neurons, all right? So every neuron, regardless of the function they do, have three parts. The first part is the dendrite. That is the part of the neuron that brings information. That's a part of the neuron that bring the information. So we call this part of the neuron is called the receiver. All right, so this part of the neuron is called receiver. So the dendrite is the same thing as receiver. All right, so it's a portion of the neuron that receives the information. Now, when it receives the information, it's going to bring it to the other portion of the neuron that we call the cell body. Cell body is the same thing as, this is also the same thing as soma. So you may have heard cell body or soma is the same thing. Now, here is the cell body and the soma, the blue portion. Here is the cell body or soma is the same thing. I will be talking about the part of the cell body later. Then we have the last portion of the neuron, which is the axon. So again, neurons have three portions predominantly. The receiver, which is the dendrites, is the one that receives the stimulus. The part of the neuron that gathers the stimulus, receives the stimulus. The cell body is where the stimulus will be processed. And then the decision that is made by the cell body will be transported through the axon. All right. Now, if you remember when we were looking at muscles earlier, I talked about these axon terminals, and I talked about the synaptic end bulbs having vesicles that contain neurotransmitters. So you should remember that now. All right. Now, those are the three portions of the axon, of the neuron. So the dendrite, the receiver, the cell body, which is the part that processes the information, and the axon, the sender that dispatch the information. Now let's look at the bigger image here. Again, on this bigger image here, the first that I'm going to point here is the dendrite. So you see the dendrite, all of these are dendrites. These are dendrites, so they work in a convergent manner. They gather the information and converge it in the cell body. Now, in the cell body, we have this here, the nuclear body here. What we call nuclear body here is rough endoplasmic reticulum. All right, you know that rough endoplasmic reticulum it's rough ER, not emergency room. It is endoplasmic reticulum. Now, you know, the reason we call it rough is because it has ribosome on it, right? And I call it the pimples of ER, right? It's like just like pimples on your face. And you know that ribosome makes proteins. All right, so that means that portion of the soma, it's the portion that makes proteins. Now, we have some mitochondria there as well. And the purpose of the mitochondria is simply to make ATP, right? Since the guy needs energy. So you see mitochondria all around, right? You see mitochondria all around to make ATP. Now, the other, so you see Golgi apparatus, which is going to process the ATP. You remember that from chapter 2 and 3. which is going to process the ATP. You see the nucleus, you see the nucleolus, you see the neurofilament, which is the same thing as cytoskeleton, like microfilament. All right. Now, let me show you something very important now. Now, the color here, I'll be talking about this later, but I think I should give you a hint now. This is gray color. This nacelle body is gray color, like gray. Oops, I lost everything I typed. Like gray, G-R-A-Y. That's a gray color appearance. And that is very important because we'll be talking about it later. Now, look at this. Now, when this soma process information, the information generates an action potential. Now, let me ask you a question that I wanted to think about as I proceed. Is it everything that happens that you sense in your environment or every stimulus that comes to you, is it all of them that generate actions? Is it everything that happens in your environment that makes you to move? Is it every smell that happens in your environment that makes you to eat? That's just on a lighter note. But is it everything you see that makes you run? Is it everything that comes around you that generates an action and causes you to act? No. Some things happen. Some things even look like hurt you, but they are not enough to make you even look at it. You just feel like something happened and you just go on. You don't feel like it's a major thing that call your attention to check it. It just looks like something random. So it's not all stimulus, it's not all stimuli that generate action potential. Now, what determines if a stimulus is going to generate action potential or not is this place here, which we call the axon hillock. So what happened is this: once this soma processes the stimulus that has come into the dendrite, the decision of the stimuli, in quote, the impulse, will be dropped here. It will be processed, the decision will be dropped here. It will be processed, the decision will be dropped at the axon hillock. It will be processed, the decision will be dropped at the axon hillock. So the axon hillocks look like, I don't know if I'll call it reservoir, but it's more like the neck of the axon where the decision of the soma is going to be dropped. Until this is enough to cause an action, it won't drive through the axon until it is enough. So once it gathers here and it becomes enough to fire an action potential, then it will fire an action potential that will proceed and travel through the axon. I'll talk about that more later. I just want to start it now. Now, that tells you something. The action potential may happen and it may not happen. It's not every time. So some things, when an action potential is not happening, we call it a graded potential or localized potential. Just take note of that. I'll talk about it later. And again, if you look at this, the continuation of the axon leads to the end. You see the synaptic terminals where you have the synaptic end bulb that contain neurotransmitters. You remember that? All right. Now, there are two neurons on this page now, and it's not in any order. It's in this order anyway. The first neuron is the one that is before the synaptic terminal or the synaptic point, the synapse. Synapse simply means where two things join, where they join together. So the neuron before the first neuron before the synapse is called presynaptic. The neuron after the synapse is called postsynaptic. All right. So presynaptic cell, postsynaptic cell, presynaptic neuron, postsynaptic neuron, simply based on their location on which one comes first or which one comes after. Now, so I've talked about this. I think it's better to just continue. We've talked about this synaptic vesicle. Now I'm going to look at the types of neuron before I break this video, and I'll start again on the next part. Now, the portion of the neuron, there are three types of neurons. Based on structure, there are three types. The first type is I'll start with the first type, which is the unipolar. I'll start with this. Now, unipolar neurons simply means uni means one. All right. So unipolar simply means one pole or one projection. Now, what does that mean? Now, this is the neuron. If you look at this neuron here, you have the soma or the cell body here. Now, if you look at this soma now, there's just one projection. There's just one opening, one process that projects from the soma. It's not two. This is one, then it now splitted into two. So you see, it is just one. It's just like this. There's one projection, and the projection now split into two. All right. So there's just one projection that proceeds from the soma, except that the one projection now splitted into two. So we call that one pole neuron. So unipolar neuron. Now that same projection, it's actually an axon. So you see, it's actually an axon. But the one end of the axon serves as dendrite, which receive information, while the other end continue as the axon that have the synaptic terminal, where you have synaptic vesicle, where you are going to have neurotransmitters. So these neurons are usually sensory neurons. They are usually the neuron that bring information into the central nervous system. You see, dendrite and axon just have a single process, and both of them function as axon. However, it's one hand that functions as dendrite, just one hand, while it is majorly an axon. You can see that. Now, the dendrite is at the tip, distal tip, you see that? Axons extending to the CNS, ending in synaptic end bulb, the cell bodies in ganglia. Okay, I told you I will still talk about cell bodies later. All right, let's look at the bipolar. Now, when you look at this, you can tell that this is a bipolar neuron. Bipolar means that it has two poles. So it's more like you have this neuron, and then you have two projections from the neuron. You see, like this, there are two projections that come from this neuron. This is a bipolar neuron, because if you look at the neuron, you can see one projection here, two projection here. So these are two projections from one neuron. One of the projection is the dendrite. The second projection is the axon. Now, this kind of neuron, you see them majorly around the retina of the eye. All right. Now, the third kind of neurons are the multipolar neurons. The multipolar neurons is like this kind of neuron I showed you earlier, where we have multiple dendrites. So now if you look at this is one projection, second projection, third projection, three projection, four projection, five projections. So from this neuron alone, we have about 5 projections. One of the projection, or one of the processes, in fact 6 rather, one of the processes serve as the axon. One of the processes serve as the axon, while the other 5 serve as dendrites. That is a multipolar neuron. And you see, you find this kind of neuron in the brain and spinal cord, where the dendrite is bringing a lot of stimulus so that it's converged there and interpreted. So you see this kind of neuron majorly in the central nervous system. All right. Now, I'll quickly talk about the neuroglial cells. I'll quickly talk about neuroglial cells before I close this video.
I just told my mom not to think about it. I should just let it go.
All right. So we'll look at neuroglial cells now briefly. There are 6 kinds of cells that we call neuroglial cells. 4 of them are in the central nervous system, and 2 of them are in the peripheral nervous system. Now, when you look at the neuroglial cells, they systematically does the same job. The only thing is one is in the central nervous system doing the same job, while the other is in the peripheral nervous system doing the same job. So the way to take note of them is based on what they do, and so that helps you to know, to connect them together. So you know these and these do the same thing, but this is in the central nervous system, this is in the peripheral nervous system. So neuroglial cells or glial cells make 50% of the central nervous system volume, and they are capable of mitotic division, unlike neurons. So when you say there are tumors growing in the brain or tumors growing in the central nervous system, that or anything that has to do with tumor, it is related to the neuroglial cells, because nerve cells or neuron itself do not undergo cell division. All right. Now, I will use this table, and that will be enough to talk about all the cells that we have as neuroglial cells. So, like I said, there are 6 of them, and these 2 are in the peripheral nervous system, the satellite cell and the Schwann cell. Then in the central nervous system, we have the ependymal cells, we have the oligodendrocyte, we have the astrocyte, and we have the microglia. So when you look at the Schwann cell and oligodendrocyte, these 2 does equivalently the same job. The only difference is you must know their location. You must know that oligodendrocyte is in the central nervous system and Schwann cell is in the peripheral nervous system. You just need to take note that the one that starts with S are in the peripheral nervous system, and the one that start with, the other ones are in the central nervous system. There are ways to pull this like an acronym. You can use like OMEN. I think OMEN works. This should work with OMEN. OMEN. So this is oligodendrocyte, microglia, ependyma, and sorry, it's not. Yeah, there's no OMEN there. It's E, it's A, not E. All right, sorry. Just link that up with an acronym that may help. All right. Now, so when you look at this, oligodendrocyte and Schwann cell, they both produce myelin on the axon. All right, you see that? Oligodendrocyte myelinates central nervous system axon. Schwann cell is responsible for myelination of the peripheral axon. So what they do, it's about the same thing. Now, what is myelin? Myelin is this. If you are able to see me now, if you look at me, myelin is simply, what I'm touching now is a cable. But there's something inside this cable that conducts electricity or conducts network. This cable, what I'm touching now, is going to help the conduction, but it's not actually the cable. This is a myelin. All right. So what myelin does on neuron is to coat it, which I'm going to show you in a bit now. What myelin does is to coat the neuron. All right. So you see this neuron now. This is myelin on it. But let me go ahead and show you actual myelin, how it is on neurons. Oh, sorry. So if you look at this slide, I have this slide. Okay, very good. So if you look at this, this is actually how myelins are on neurons. So these are myelins. This is a myelin. This is myelin. This is myelin. All of this that you are seeing here is myelin. Now, what is very interesting there? So this actually is the axon, but the myelin is the coat you are seeing on the axon. Now, what is very important here is to know that myelin is white in appearance. So when we get to the point when we are talking about white matter, gray matter, it will make sense to you. Why myelin is white. So the myelin make the axon to be white because myelin itself, this myelin, right? It is white in color. All right. So let's go. I'll talk about that more. So the oligodendrocyte and the Schwann cells are the cells that does myelination, that myelinate the axon. Now take note, they don't myelinate the whole neuron, they only myelinate the axon. All right, so they myelinate the axon in different locations. Now satellite cells, look at what they do. They surround the neuron cell bodies in ganglia, and they help to regulate. So they regulate oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and neurotransmitter levels. Now see astrocytes. See what astrocyte does. They maintain blood-brain barrier, meaning that they prevent blood from getting into the brain. So they do a great job. Now they provide structural support. You see that? Now look at what they do. They regulate ions, nutrients, the soft gas nutrients. They help to recycle neurotransmitter, just exactly what satellite cell does. So if you are linking it together, oligodendrocyte and Schwann, astrocyte and satellite cells. And if you are looking at satellite cells too, look at their shape. Look at the shape of astrocytes. They look very close together. And if you look at Schwann cell as well, Schwann cell, looking at what they do, is close to oligodendrocyte. Now, the other two here are the ones that they don't have any other linkage. Now, these cells, the microglial cells, what they do majorly is immune function. They work more like how osteoclast also works. So you see, they remove cell debris, just the same way osteoclasts remove the bone matrix. They remove cell debris, they remove waste, and they also help to remove pathogens through phagocytosis. So they also hit pathogens, bacteria, any form of pathogen that are present in the cell. The ependymal cells, they line the brain ventricles. And what do? The major thing they do is to produce what we call CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. So they produce cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. All right. Now they are responsible for production, circulation, and storage of the CSF. That is all that the neuroglial cells does. All right. So I'm going to stop at this point, then continue in the next chapter.